You're listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I am joined by Cathy Loerzel, who's been on the podcast before. She is the co-author of Redeeming Heartache. Cathy, welcome back.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me.
You and I have talked previously on the podcast about this book, along with Dan Allender, your co-author. But today, the reason you're here is because you and I together are going to be co-teaching a Redeeming Heartache event on Saturday, May 21st. And here's the best part. It is going to be live in person.
All right.
So this one-day conference, it will be held right here in the beautiful city of Fort Collins, Colorado, which is exactly an hour north of the Denver airport. And it is coming up Saturday, May 21st. So let's start today by asking the question of why. Why are we doing a Redeeming Heartache conference on May 21st, and why have you been doing them sporadically across the country over the past year? And here's one primary reason. We know that trauma is real. It deeply affects our brains and our bodies, but we also know that the resurrection of Jesus is real, which means that Jesus takes the trauma in our stories and he creates glory, calling, meaning out of that trauma in our lives. And that's a big sentence, so let me just summarize it and say it again. Trauma, we know, is real. It affects us deeply. And we know that the resurrection is also real, which means that Jesus creates, he takes trauma from our pasts and creates glory, calling, meaning in our lives. That's one of the central theses of your book, Redeeming Heartache. And I'm curious, as I say it, what it stirs in you. What's your reaction to it?
I mean, my first thoughts are, thank God the resurrection is real, because you can't live in this world and not see all the harm, all the heartache, all the trauma. And yet we're also left looking at such beauty, such goodness, such gifting. And I think so much of our work is to figure out how to live in the tension in between those things. So how do we handle the fact that there's so much trauma and debris, but we're also left with I was just driving, I had horseback riding lessons this morning, and me doing horseback riding is a whole other podcast and story altogether. But as I was driving back, I got to drive over 520, which is this incredible space in Seattle, and you looking at the Olympic Mountains. And it's like you see Lake Washington and then the Olympics, and it's beautiful. And I'm staring at it, and I'm stunned. I'm absolutely stunned. And I actually started to cry because it was so beautiful. And so I think the mercy of God understands that, like, we're living in this beautiful world that is so full of darkness and heartache, and we need a way to reconcile those things. And the way that we reconcile them is by the death and resurrection of Jesus. I don't know why else or how else to live in this world except to sort out the balance between life and death all the time, every day.
And as you share about the Olympic Mountains and going across 520, seeing this beauty that moves you to tears, it makes me think, it makes me wonder, what if it's possible that God can create something more beautiful than the Olympic Mountains in the landscape of the hearts of the traumatized? And it's not a rhetorical question. Like, that's what you're claiming.
Yes.
The subtitle of the book is How Past Suffering Reveals Our True Calling. And so there's a linkage between the harm of our past and our calling in the present and future. And there's something immensely hopeful about that and meaningful about that. And when you talk about seeing the Olympic Mountains and the beauty of that, I mean, how important and cool would it be if each of us could begin to see something of the Olympic Mountains that God is creating in our hearts in the midst of and through the trauma that we've experienced. That's not minimizing the trauma. It's not saying that the trauma was a means to the end of our further glory. By no means, we're not saying that. But we are saying that the Olympic Mountains are being created in people's hearts.
If I understand the work of evil in this world, it's to tell us that it's too late, that we're too broken, that there's no hope. And often we'll hear those whisperings in us like, well, if anyone really knew what you were really like underneath, or make sure you pretend, or make sure they never find you out, or just give up because you're always just going to be the way that you are. Every year at New Year's, I hate it. The New Year's resolution thing makes me bonkers because it's not true, and it's not what redemption and repair and the resurrection really look like, right? It's that sense of like self-improvement is not the hope and the promise of the resurrection. The hope and promise of the resurrection is that we are broken and we are incredibly beautiful. Both are true at the same time, and Jesus knows that and has created a path forward where we get to reclaim the beauty that we were once created for, that has been marred and marked by the fall, marred and marked by sin, by our own failures, by other people's failures. But the resurrection gets to be true in our hearts and in our bodies as we seek to tell the truth, and as we seek to understand more of how evil has come into our lives in particular moments to wreak havoc and mar that which is the most beautiful parts of us, that were most created for beauty and created to bring beauty to the earth. I think that's so incredibly hopeful, but it's so different than like, okay, I'm going to just pull myself up by my bootstraps. Like if resurrection wasn't real, if God didn't intervene in some way that on a spiritual level, on a mystical, magical level, I don't think we each have the capacity to become better on our own. Like we can try really hard, but how many people do you know are just exhausted by it? Exhausted by the feeling of like, well, I'll get back on my Peloton bike or I'm going to become a better person tomorrow. It's exhausting, and it's just not the invitation of God. The invitation of God is to lean into the mystical sense that the resurrection is real and that beauty can be created in us as we give ourselves over to grief, over to heartache, over to the reality of what's been true in our stories. But it's only through giving ourselves over to it, not pulling ourselves up, right? It's the inverse. It's letting ourselves be taken in by the beauty and the mystery, and then hoping that and believing and having faith that God is on the other side and that there can be something good.
And on May 21, you and I are going to dive into these things in depth. You're going to start
hmm
with the morning teaching time and say a bit about what you're going to lay out in that first morning session.
When we step into this, one of the hardest things, interestingly enough, one of the hardest things for people who have been believers for a long time is to give themselves over to the reality of death, is to give themselves over to the reality that we have suffered, we have caused suffering, and that we need to take a deep look into how that came to be and how we have participated in order to be able to truly grieve what's happened and then find a way forward. And so in the morning, we're going to be talking about what we were created for. We were created for shalom, for perfect connection and relationship with God, self, others, and the earth. And that's the premise that we're going to be starting with, and then understanding and unpacking the difference between what we were created for and the world that we're now living in, and then how we learn to cope and shift our styles of relating to figure out how to live in this world without getting further harmed. And so that's the main part that we're going to be looking at in the morning, and then really doing the why. why do we need to do this work? Why is it important to reckon with our stories, reckon with what's happened to us, what we've done to other people, the systems that we're a part of? Why do we need to look at that? And what's the hope of God in terms of the redemption, the arc of redemption that happens when we're actually willing to tell a more truthful story about ourselves, about God, and about the world that we're living in?
And after you teach on that, I will come up and I'm going to begin with the following passage from Isaiah 61. In the opening verses of Isaiah 61, I've quoted it many times on this podcast. We read that a day is coming when God will bind up the brokenhearted and proclaim freedom for the captives. And what I think Isaiah is brilliantly linking there is the reality of how your heart has been broken, bind up the brokenhearted. He's linking that with how you become a captive. And we all do. We become captives. We become enslaved. We become bound out of and as a result of our sinful ways of responding to the ways we've been traumatized and wounded. And so, in short, when we're wounded, we begin living in such a way that we won't be hurt like that again. And that way of living enslaves us. We become bound to addictions, to particular ways of being in relationship with others. We become bound to loyalties to our parents or to other particular people. There are lots of ways that we are bound. And many of us are stuck in these binds. And in your book, Redeeming Heartache, you and Dan argue that we will stay bound until we address our past story. And let me just read a short quote from it. Here's what you guys say. Until a bridge is constructed between the past and the present, we are bound to repeat the past without recognizing the real war we are fighting. We end up fighting or flighting from an enemy that's real, but fail to see that we're also reacting to wounds that are as much a threat to our thriving as anything in the present. Now, there's so much in that paragraph. Cathy, can you just unpack those two sentences for us? And will you also say more about how does our past story become reenacted in the present?
As you're speaking, I was trying to kind of think of a story, because I think so often the theory around this is more difficult to understand than when we actually live it out. So for me, I said I went horseback riding this morning. I have spent the last couple of years working pretty diligently to try to get back into my body, to reconnect with my body. And I can do things like, go to yoga, or I was working out, like doing interval training for a while, doing all these things, like trying to be like, okay, I'm gonna figure out how to get back in my body, because I'm at war. Like, I know my body and I don't have a great relationship, and we haven't for a long time. There's a lot that I can do in the present to try to fix that, quote unquote, right?
Mhm.
But it always falls flat until I understand why I'm at war with my body, why I'm ambivalent about my sensuality, the parts of me that come alive, the parts of me that I'm afraid of. Why am I afraid of those things, and why have those parts of me needed to be separated in order for me to feel safe? So I can't fix that in the present without understanding how that came to be in my past. And so I think so many of us are trying to fix the present, but knowing, like, you're just mowing the yard over and over again without actually getting to the root of the dandelion, right? Like, you actually need to go and dig out the weeds. You need to get to the root of those things, because otherwise you're mowing over all the weeds. And that works to a degree, but not if you actually want good, healthy grass. And so I think that quote, what it's inviting you to is have you made the links between, the wars and the places in your current life that are not bringing life, are not bringing beauty, are not bringing goodness. Like, we're meant to be connected and in sync and integrated with our bodies. That's how we were created. But, for me, that's been a war. And I can link that back to past sexual abuse, a family of origin issues, places where I turned on my body because it betrayed me. How well do you know those stories in your own heart? And when you start to go back to those origin stories and understand those things, the present actually fixes itself to some degree, or at least you can understand more of what's going on for you. And so, like today for me, I was riding, and horses are incredible because they're incredibly intuitive around where you are emotionally. And so I was on this horse, and the horse's name is True, which is such a great name for a horse. And in order for me to be in sync with True, I have to really be in sync with my own body. And so I'm trying to like breathe and bring my body online. And I felt this sense of pleasure starting to like arise in my body, where it was like I felt free, I felt alive, I felt aligned. And immediately there was this sense, this quick sense in my brain that said danger,
Right.
danger. Like, you are not allowed to feel this. We don't trust this feeling. And there was this other part of me that was like, we've been waiting for this feeling. you know but I've done enough work where I can tend to my own soul in that moment and be able to say, oh, I understand your fear. I get it. It's okay. And like, we're allowed to feel pleasure, we're allowed to feel goodness and connection, and it's okay, right? But the only reason I was allowed to do that in that moment is because of the work that I've done on my story in my past to understand the link between those things.
Yes. And it calls to mind for me a very important passage in Jeremiah 6. It's repeated in Jeremiah 8, where God indicts the leaders, the spiritual leaders of Israel, by saying this. He says, prophets and priests alike, in other words, the spiritual leaders of the community, they dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious.
Hmm.
Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace. And sadly, many of us do that with our own wounds.
Yes.
We're like the leaders of Israel. We don't take our wounds seriously. We dress them as though they were smaller than they are. And we say, peace, peace, everything's fine, when everything is not fine. And you and I are doing this Redeeming Heartache conference in part because we want people to take their wounds seriously. We want you to give your wounds the care that they deserve and the care that they need in order to heal. But also, we're doing this conference because we want people to see that the very wounds that they have suffered will give them clues about their calling, about who God made them to be in the world. And that is well, in my mind, that's the essence of that word redeeming. That's the essence of redemption. It's called redeeming heartache. There is something glorious that is created out of heartache. And part of that gloriousness is I get to find out who Adam really is and step more fully into myself. So, Cathy, can you talk a little about how how do our wounds give us clues about our calling?
I think you and I did a podcast a while ago on curses and agreements. And we talk a bit about this because I think the place where we are most attacked and that evil tends to our trauma is directly related to the places that were most meant to bring glory and beauty to this earth.
Say that one more time because that's such an important sentence. Just say it one more time.
All right. That evil tends and brings trauma to the places where we are most meant to bring beauty and goodness to the world, like here on earth as it is in heaven. And so, so for me, like let's go back to the body, right? So I know I have a history of severing my body, and I've led out of a place of disembodiment that's created a lot of harm. I'm at war all the time with sensuality, with relationship, with my marriage. Like there are all these places that are interconnected. And so what I have to then assume is that there's something absolutely incredible that I am meant to bring to this world when I am embodied. That's what I'm thinking in my head, right? That's where I get to stand on the neck of evil and say no. Because if there's been this much war separating me from my body, I have to assume that there is going to be an incredible amount of beauty and power and goodness that gets to manifest the being of God on this earth through me when I'm connected, when I'm integrated. And so I'm now looking at my life and going, okay, so if I want to serve God, if I want to serve Jesus in my calling, I need to do this work to be integrated. I need to find my way back where my body and soul meet in order for the spirit to manifest, and I get to do different work. And so I'm now looking at my calling in a very different way, right? It's not what I'm going to create or what next book I'm going to write or what I'm going to teach from the front. Right now, I'm thinking, gosh, there's been so much warfare, so much cursing, so much assault that's kept me separated. I am now fiercely committed to this journey because I believe deeply. I don't know what, the next iteration of my calling will look like, but I have to assume that a big part of it is going to be reconnecting to the parts of me that have been severed for so long. And evil has attended to that severing, has continued to bring me stories that have said that my body is dangerous, that if I connect, right? So you're always wanting to look for where am I most being assaulted, to then understand that that is the place where we need to go straight into in order for us to understand how our harm is directly connected to our calling. Because when that's healed, I can't even imagine what each of us will get to do and bring into the beauty of this world. And I think you said this earlier, like we're a mess. We're not doing well. And it's not to say that there have been other places in history where we're doing remarkably well. Like we're human, we're living in a fallen world, like we're a mess typically. But in this season, on the back end of the pandemic and all the division that's going on, specifically in our country, but also all over the world, we need Christians, and I would say all people, but particularly Christians, to be healed enough to be able to tend to the kingdoms around us that we're specifically called to tend to. And so I think that's why I'm doing these conferences all over the country, because there's a sense of, look, we have to mature. We have to heal. We have to get out of our own divisiveness. We have to move closer into our bodies to manifest the spirit. We need to be more healed, not fully healed, that will never happen, but we need to be more healed in order to be able to tend to the bleeding out that's happening all around us. And if the church can't do that, then my goodness, like I was just talking to this guy in Miami, and he said, gosh, wouldn't it be wonderful if Christians were known for their love and kindness? If that was the thing that we were known for. And it just made me want to weep. And for me, I'm like, the reason why we're not known for that is because we still have work to do around our own healing and getting closer to our stories. And so we're reenacting our trauma in our churches, in our nonprofits, in our marriages, in our friendships, because we're not tending well enough to the places that evil has been tending to for our lifetime, to keep us disconnected from our glory and the glory of God.
And one of the things I'm going to dive into at the conference is how our experiences with our parents affect our hearts and our brains. In other words, how we are wounded in our families of origin. But before I do that, I'm going to present what I call an apologia for Christians who may be reluctant to do story work. An apologia is simply a defense, it's an explanation of why it makes sense to engage your story and why it's biblical to engage your story. So some people may be considering engaging their story in more depth, but objections kind of come up in their mind. And these objections are understandable. So I'm going to address them. And let me just give you a preview of what they are. The first is, as a Christian, I'm called to look at the present and the future, not quote unquote dwell on the past. I shouldn't look at the past. So I'll address that. Objection two, looking at my story is just self-indulgent, introspective, navel-gazing, and I'm supposed to be focused on God and others, not focused on myself. It's a reasonable objection. Sounds biblical. I'm going to address that. Objection three, I don't want to blame my parents. Lots of people get short-circuited when they begin to engage their story simply because they have this sense inside of, I don't want to blame my parents. And so we're going to talk about how story work is not in any way condemning or judging your parents in a negative sense. And then objection four, the last one, is my parents did the best they could. They tried their hardest. And so there's no point in looking at how they harmed me. So I'll take some time to address all four of those objections to engaging your story. And then I'm going to take a deep dive into what I call the big six, which are six things that every kid needs from their parents in order to develop like a baseline of health in their brain, in their hearts. And the purpose of this explanation of the big six is so that you can get a sense of the particular way that your heart was wounded. Because again, the claim is that your wounding leads to your calling. And if that's true, it might be wise to understand something of the particular ways that your heart has been wounded. So that is the morning sessions. That's the morning. And then lunch break, hour and a half lunch break. And then Cathy, when we come back, what are you going to tackle in the first afternoon session?
After you talk about that, which I think is going to be really helpful for people to be able to understand what we were meant for with our families. And because again, so often people dismiss their own stories of harm because they feel like they're not big enough. They're not, big T traumas. They're not like severe abuse or neglect or physical harm. Their parents, like you said before, they did the best they could. And so I love the fact that people who attend this conference will have that as a baseline. And then what I'll do is move us into 6 archetypes. And for those of you who have ever heard me teach or have been to the Allender Center, you know that we love to teach in stories. And I particularly love to teach in archetypes. And really, archetype is just they're characters that are fairly universal that we can all relate to. And so there are 3 core heart wounds that we'll look at with their archetypes. And that is the orphan, the stranger, and the widow. And I'll go into depth of what happens for a child to have the orphan wound, to have the stranger wound, and to have the widow wound. And then I'll move into when those things start to receive healing. How does that transform into calling, into how we're meant to be on this earth? And for an orphan, you're meant to move into the category of priest. For the stranger, you're meant to move into the category of prophet. And for the widow, you're meant to move into the category of queen or king. And that may feel kind of weird, but each one of those archetypes are thick and lovely with kind of handholds for you to be able to find your own story in the story of the orphan. and the stranger and the widow. And then that will help you orient your own story and understand kind of what happened to you. And then create an imagination within you to understand where God may be growing you and what redemption may look like for those parts of your hearts that have been wounded and marred. And I think we don't know how to change or even what the hope of change looks like until we have an imagination for what could be. And again, not the imagination that feels like fantasy where all of a sudden, after 43 years of life, I'm all of a sudden gonna be someone who wakes up at 5 a.m., makes my bed, and then goes out for a run. Like that fantasy is over. That's no longer true. So what's my fantasy or my imagination for what redemption looks like for me? And that's what we'll go into with the prophet, priest, and king queen archetype as well.
And one of the things that's so helpful about these six archetypes is that the first three, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, give us a rubric for understanding. They give us language for understanding the particularity of how we have been wounded. And so for me, of those three, my story correlates most closely to the stranger. And we could talk about why that is, but it's very helpful to think about, okay, stranger, what does that mean in scripture? Because each of these terms it's these three terms that appear over and over in the Old Testament. God is peculiarly and intentionally concerned with the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, and they mean something different. A widow is different than an orphan, is different than a stranger. And it doesn't mean that I don't have widow parts in me or orphan parts in me. I do, but my story most closely aligns with that of a stranger. And therefore, my heartache and what drives my personality most closely aligns with how strangers move about in a hostile world. And what's so fun about the rubric, the matrix that you've developed, is that, okay, if I'm a stranger, the redemption of that means that I'm going to be moving in the trajectory of a prophet. And that means something very particular that you're going to flesh out. And it does, it gives me an imagination for, oh, this is how my particular wounds can be redeemed.
Hmm.
This is what it might look like for Adam to be more fully Adam. This is what it looks like to be my prophetic self. And you're going to do that with the orphan who becomes a priest, with the widow who becomes a king queen. And it's just such helpful categories for thinking about your life and thinking about what healing actually might look like for you.
I think that's the beauty of story, right? Is that is actually where we become more oriented and find, like you said, find language. And oftentimes when we're left in the dark as children, so often the wounding that happens to us is that we're left to figure out the complexity of what it means to live in this world alone.
Right.
Or we're given false information and told that we're crazy for what we're feeling, or told to stop crying or stop being so dramatic, right? And so I think what this does is it gives us categories and language for how to then sink deeper into what's been true about our own stories, which I love. And I love the fact that you brought up stranger, because stranger is it's a category I understand now more than I did, I think, when we wrote the book. But it's such a lovely category to even understand your own life force in the midst of, right? Because for a stranger, it is okay to jump in to
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So stranger, I'm married to a stranger, and so I feel like I have a front row seat to his war. But here's the deal, is that strangers get a really bad rap because they can be incredibly disruptive, because they in some ways their life force is against. Like you're going to push against things. But when you look back to the tender boy that I know you were, I know my husband was, who was in awe and looking at the world, the reality is that your heart saw beauty and goodness and what the world was meant to be in a way that was captivating to you. But you also saw that people were not bringing that forward in the way that it was meant to be. So you are the ones who saw more about the gap between Eden and the fall than anyone else because you felt it in your bodies. You're the empaths. You're the ones who knew. Like, so, but in the beginning, when you saw things, you would then go to a parent to explain, like, oh, this thing is wrong and it's supposed to be fixed or it's supposed to be better. But instead of the parent saying, oh my gosh, you're right, let's fix it, they told you that you were crazy. They told you that you were being too dramatic, that you're exposing things, because the reality is people don't want to be exposed. And so parents who have their incredibly prophetic hearted children will often tell them to be less, to stop talking, to stop exposing, right? And that child is taking that in, and all they're thinking is, I'm too much. And in order for me to fit, I need to be different. I don't fit into this world. I can't just be nice. One of my favorite examples of the stranger is like the kid in the car on the way to church. And their dad is the deacon, their mom sings in the choir, and they also know that that morning over the breakfast table and then in the car, their dad was raging at their mom or raging at them. But the expectation was that as soon as you get out of the car, you're all meant to flip a switch and be fine. You're meant to flip a switch and then go in. Everyone has a smile. You're meant to be the good kids. You're meant to obey your parents and tell everyone in the church that you are fine, they are fine, everyone is fine, right? You're meant to reflect that back. And the stranger, the child, the stranger child is going, no, uh-uh, I'm not going to do that. And so they become the rebellious one, they become the one who refuses to get a car or is wearing all black, or, however that manifests. Or they realize in order to fit, I need to dumb down, to numb out everything that I'm feeling. So they become addicts and they become dissociated and they become shriveled up inside so that they don't have to know all the things that they really know. But the reality for the stranger is that they're actually the prophet. They're seeing the truth. They're seeing what's true in the world, but they've been rendered powerless to do anything about it. And they realize the world isn't actually interested in changing. The world is interested in them shutting up. And they internalize that. But as the stranger learns how to care for those wounds, how to contain and understand their rage, and that it's actually connected to heartbreak, then they get to move into the true sense of who they are, which is the prophet. But a prophet will continue to create havoc and blow things up if they're not tending to their stranger hearts that have experienced such harm and such wounding. And so that's the hope, again, that we're able to start to make those links, and that we'll start to understand, where have you been called a stranger? Where have you been pushed out of the city gates? Where have you been told to be small and to stop talking and mocked, for all of that you see? And where have you turned on your own heart? And where have you turned on others because of how inhospitable they have been to the truth that you hold in your body and your heart?
And what you just did for the stranger prophet, you will do on May 21st for the other categories. Like, you'll get into this stuff and flesh it out. And it can be so, again, helpful to orient us to like our story, our calling, our name. So helpful. So, summary, Redeeming Heartache Conference, it will be live in person here in Fort Collins, Colorado on Saturday, May 21. Tickets are $85. You can sign up by going to my website, adamyoungcounseling.com, and just click on offerings. And for all you therapists out there, you can get 6 CEUs by attending the conference. If you are considering flying in from out of town, or driving in from somewhere else, let me tell you that Fort Collins is a beautiful place, particularly in May. There's awesome hiking. There's incredibly scenic views. There's a beautiful lake called Horsetooth Reservoir. So you can make a weekend out of it. Engage your heart on Saturday, play all day on Sunday. You won't regret it. It's coming right up. Cathy, thank you for joining me to kind of give an overview.
Thank you, Adam. It's really good to be here.